Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today we're talking about some common composting problems because composting is pretty straightforward, but sometimes issues do arise, and finding out how to tackle some of these common problems is going to help you compost quicker. It's going to help you compost a lot more efficiently, and that's really what we want. We want to be able to be producing compost from our own gardens to feed our soil and really kind of foster that regenerative cycle that is happening, right? If we compost from our gardens and we're returning nutrients back to the garden's feeding us, it's all going to kind of come full circle. And composting really is the cornerstone of the organic gardener's soil improvement strategy, but also their feeding strategy for their gardens. So let's dig in and talk about some of the most common composting problems. So number one has got to be a bad smell. And there are lots of different composter odors that happen, and you will start to see those as you begin your composting journey with your gardening journey. And the likely cause of bad smells are not enough air and too much green matter. And that happens because there's microorganisms that are in that compost, and they need air, they need oxygen to be able to conduct the breakdown process. And what happens is if you put too much green material in there, especially grass clippings, right, we're very good at kind of cutting the grass. We're probably less good at putting the grass into the compost bin, certainly breaking it up into layers. And what happens is if you dump a bunch of grass straight off the lawn into your composter, it'll kind of create this really thick mat, and it's going to stop air from getting through. And then what happens is a process known as anaerobic respiration. And that's kind of what happens like at the bottom of ponds and stuff like that, where there's not a lot of air that grows, and then when that's disturbed, it smells horrific, like sulfurous, really stinky, not pleasant smell, right? And that's what's happening, is this anaerobic respiration by the microbes. So the way that we fix that is by adding in air. So we can add in air by turning that compost pile, like turning things in it to mix things up. So if you've got a standing compost pile, right, you want to take off what's holding it, you want to dig it all out, you want to lift that nice and high and sort of shake things through to get some air into it, and then that's going to help those microorganisms get the oxygen that they need, and then they're going to restart that breakdown process. Another way that we can add to the air and reduce the smells in our compost bin is to add more fibrous material. These are typically kind of brown materials. They're very heavy on the carbon. They're things that have been dead for quite some time. A real quick and easy trick is to shred up newspapers, junk mail, those kind of things, and add those to your compost bin and kind of mix that in, especially if you're dumping in things like grass clippings, right? Mix in some fibrous material in with those grass clippings to kind of help create these air pockets, because that's essentially what these carbon materials are doing, is creating like gaps where air can kind of move through the pile, and this is what we really want. We want to kind of get in plenty of air. The other thing that might be causing it is the pile is too wet, and things are kind of getting stagnant in there because it's really, really soggy. So we want to kind of uncover the pile to try and dry it out if we can. Although if it is chucking it down with rain and has been chucking it down with rain for a while, and we might want to try to cover it so we can, not let any more water in there, so we can try and give the pile a little bit of a break to then start to dry out. And we can help dry out the pile by adding a lot of these, dry, fibrous materials. Again, shredded paper is really good, shredded cardboard. Even sawdust and wood chips or wood shavings can be really good to help like suck out some of that moisture. They're really good at like taking the moisture out, and then those fibrous materials will start to decompose a little bit. I've spent the weekend like chipping little branches and prunings off the trees, and pulling up all of the old sunflower stalks that we had that I'd kind of left in over fall and winter, because I wanted to, provide a food source for the local birds. Because that's one of the fun things that I like to do, is to talk to my parents about the types of birds that we see in our gardens, because they're very different ones in the UK versus the ones here in the US. And my parents were super excited to tell me about they've recently got a pair of goldfinches in their garden, and we've never ever in all my life of my parents ever had goldfinches nesting in the garden. So they were really excited about that. And it kind of reminded me I got those sunflower stalks that I need to remove and start to shred. But these sunflower stalks, and same with Jerusalem artichoke stalks, they are a really great source of this fibrous material. They're a great carbon resource, and that's kind of why sunflowers and Jerusalem artichokes are kind of one of those great crops to grow if you're trying to compost and have a more sustainable garden, because all of that energy that they're using to take up and grow so tall, all of that is stored carbon, right? Because that's how the plants grow. They're producing sugars and carbohydrates, right? And that carbon is then locked up, and then we can use that in our compost. But these kind of fibrous materials really suck out the moisture in your piles, and they can really help if you've got too much water going on in your compost pile that's causing a bad smell. So bad smells likely cause not enough air, too much green matter, pile too wet. So we want to fix it by adding paper, fibrous material, reducing the amount of green materials being added. So if you've just been adding lots and lots of kitchen scraps and very little else, things are going to get stinky, they're going to get slimy. So start to add in some fibrous material to help kind of take some of that smell and create some air pockets. Another trick to help reduce bad smells is to cover the layer that you've put into your compost heap with some soil from the garden. And this is a really, really good trick, because compost is going to happen naturally. But if we're adding a lot of this stuff to our garden bed, then when we add soil from the garden to our compost bin, we're actually going to be adding some more microorganisms into that compost heap, and we can help kickstart things composting again. So it's a really good trick to not only reduce the smell, because if you're putting a few shovelfuls straight on top of the stuff that's kind of stinking a little bit, it's going to help reduce that smell, but you're also providing more microorganisms to help break everything down in your compost bin. Let's talk about the pile is being dry. So this is especially a problem if your pile is dry in the middle. You are going to have drier edges in your compost bin. That's really normal. And part of the reason why we turn our compost heap is to kind of mix these drier materials in with, slightly wetter materials. And the stuff that's kind of going to be dry isn't going to be breaking down. So we need to add water to our compost piles to help them break down. Now, if you've got a lot of fibrous material, things are going to dry out pretty quickly. We need green matter, so we need things like kitchen scraps, grass clippings, fresh green things in our compost bin, because they're going to break down and they're going to produce water, because they're high in nitrogen, they're high in water. And adding water to the pile is going to help things break down. So if your pile is dry in the middle and you want to kind of put your hand in and kind of test how things feel in your compost pile, that's going to tell you a lot about how things are working. If it's super dry in the middle, then add some more green matter to it, or add some water. So when I'm building the pile or turning the compost pile, I like to get a 3-gallon watering can and I will water the piles. So as I'm kind of, taking stuff from the top and I'm now putting that at the bottom, I'm going to just kind of water everything. So I like to let the layers get about, 6 inches at least to maybe a foot before I then water stuff. So I'll kind of put things in, then I'll water, and then I'll maybe put another layer. If I'm building a pile from scratch and I'm putting layers in, so let's say, all this shredded sunflower stalks that I did, I definitely watered those. So I put those into the compost pile and then I added some water. It probably wasn't the full 3 gallons at that point. I added other materials and stuff and then, kind of kept watering, but I watered the entire pile with that 3 gallons eventually. And what that does is that's going to help kind of, wet down those fibrous materials so that they can start to break down. Now, really good rule of thumb for your compost pile is that it should feel like a well wrung out sponge. So if you think about when you're doing the dishes, right, when you squeeze out that sponge and you let it to dry, just that sort of slightly damp feel, that's how your compost pile should feel. If it's too wet, you want to add more paper and fibrous material, place a lid on it so it's got a chance to dry out. If you've got some good weather, uncover it so it can dry out a little bit. If it's too wet, if it's too dry, then we want to be adding water. My compost piles dry out very quickly, and given that I live in a very dry state, that is not uncommon. And if you're living somewhere that's pretty dry too, like California or Nevada, maybe New Mexico, like a dry pile is probably going to be one of your bigger challenges. And again, we can do that by adding a bit more green matter, so more green lush materials that have water in them. That is going to help things break down quicker, as well as providing more water. All right, let's talk about materials not decomposing, because there's a couple of reasons for this. And the first one we kind of talked about already is the pile being dry. If it's dry, things are not breaking down. The microbes need water to help break down your materials. But some of the likely causes of material not decomposing is that the material is too large. And we all do it. Every gardener that I've ever known, there comes a point during the gardening year where you're just like, screw it, I'm not chopping anymore to go into this compost pile. I'm just going to put it in as is. And unfortunately, later on in the season, when it comes to turning the compost heap, you kind of get frustrated at yourself for not chopping things up. So the bigger the material, the longer it is going to take to break down. And what we want to do is we want to kind of chop or shred materials as much as possible, because what this does is it increases the surface area, and it increases the surface area for those microorganisms, and the bigger the surface area, the faster things are going to break down. And this is great because you're providing like all of this food source for all of these microorganisms to help break things down, and that is really, really good. If you're wanting things to compost quickly and break down really fast, then you need to chop and shred and get it into small pieces. That is going to be your best strategy. And I get it. Not everybody, wants to, has the inclination to. I've put like full-blown stalks of various like brassicas in my compost bin. I've put like big old chunks of sunflower stalk in my compost bin, and they take a long time to break down. And composting can take time anyway. There are tricks that you can do to get compost quickly within sort of 18 to 30 days. But typically compost takes 6 months to 2 years to produce, which is why, we want to always be adding and working on our compost heaps and using the material that's produced as part of this composting process in the garden. But a really great tip to get through all of this stuff is, certainly if you're collecting things out of the kitchen, right? If you're kind of chopping things up and peeling stuff, it's kind of easy if you're already doing it to just maybe like snip it a little smaller, collect it in a coffee can or a bucket or whatever, was easiest for you. But certainly when it comes to pruning things, it's kind of time consuming to be doing the pruning, but even more so to be then chopping things up and putting it into the compost bin. And I really wish that when we'd pulled all the tomato plants, like I'd kind of told my family that they need to kind of chop them up a little bit beforehand. And one of the easiest ways that we did that was putting things into a large 5-gallon bucket and then just getting some of those like big old pruning shears, like the ones that you kind of do hedges with, and then just kind of chopping things up a little bit with that inside the bucket, because it kind of keeps everything together. And it was kind of easier to do it that way. Of course, you can use a chipper or a shredder to help shred chunky material, if it's able to be used in that way. Like, you got lots of branches and things, or, twigs and stuff, and you don't want to kind of hand prune them into smaller pieces all the way, right? You want to save your hands a little bit. Then obviously a wood chipper is a really, really good tool. And I have one. I've got just a little electric one. We take the blades off and we sharpen them. And it's been going like a champ. Like, we've just taken care of so much stuff that needs to be ran through there. And in fact, after this podcast is done, I've got a bunch of bramble or blackberry canes that have that got pruned out. They're all the brown dried up ones. And I'm going to be running those through the chipper today to then add into the compost bin, or use as mulch, right? That's kind of the benefit of having that, is, you've got some flexibility there. But what you will find is, as you chop and shred that material to be smaller, that you're going to see things break down a lot quicker. And as you're going through this composting process, you're going to see how the materials are changed. They're going to be things that you can recognize what they are, and it's going to start to get less and less so. And there are plants that can handle, compost that's not completely done yet. Things are, kind of recognizable still. Tomatoes are pretty good with, compost that's not quite there yet, as are winter squashes. Winter squashes are pretty good to be able to cope with, compost that hasn't composted all the way through. But plants like melons, for example, they need to, be pampered a little bit. They need to have compost that is pretty much there. Like, you can't really tell the difference between the materials that are in there. Like, you're not able to say, oh, that bit right there, that's a little bit of carrot, right? Because you're not able to see that anymore. So just understanding your garden and know how some plants are able to cope with the different stages of compost is actually quite useful for you to get a better leverage of the materials that you're producing to feed your soil and also feed your garden. But it's also a really nifty trick to help you get your garden growing a lot sooner than you might be if you were waiting to have finished compost. Next up, we're going to be talking about attracting vermin. That is something that we definitely don't want in the garden. And I'm going to be totally honest with you. A compost bin is an all-you-can-eat buffet for vermin, and they can be really strongly attracted to your compost bins. I have compost bins that are kind of on the floor, like on the ground, and I also have tumbling composters. The tumbling composters, great. I don't have issues with vermin in those because they can't get into them. They can't climb up the poles to get in there. So that's why I really love a tumbling composter, especially in an urban area. But if you have a big ground composter, some of the likely causes that are attracting vermin are the addition of cooked foods, meat, dairy, or oils. That is a surefire way to attract vermin to your pile. Now, There's a couple of ways that we can fix this. Number one is to remove those food sources. So don't add cooked foods, don't add meat, don't add dairy, and don't add oil to your compost heap. If you do want to add them, then use bokashi to ferment those before they go in, because bokashi is a really great kind of pre-composting method, but it essentially ferments your materials that are going to be going in there, and it really helps to kickstart a pile. And I've talked about bokashi before on the podcast, so definitely take a look at those episodes if you'd like to learn a little bit more. So remove cooked foods, meat, dairy, oil from your compost heap, right? That's going to really go a long way to avoid attracting vermin. But sometimes, especially if it's winter, they see all of this like lovely food sources that are going in there, like, there's partially bad apples or whatever it is that you're putting in. It doesn't necessarily need to be meat, fish, dairy, oil, or cooked food that's attracting vermin. It could be any of the food sources in there. And the one way that you can deter them from your heap is to keep turning the pile, and that's exactly what we do. So we have had, mice or even a rat. There was a rat in the compost bin a couple of years ago, and it freaked me out. Now, given like when I was younger, I had pet rats. Like all the time, and they were really, really fun as a pet. But I don't want a wild rat in my compost pile. Absolutely not. And the surefire way to deter them from the bin is obviously use a rodent-proof bin, like a tumbling composter. But if you don't have that, maybe using like a large kind of geo bin or something like that, because you've got a lot of materials in there. Get in there with your pitchfork and turn that heap, and turn it regularly, even in winter. If it's not frozen solid, as soon as you can get things, get your fork in there to turn it over, do so. And the more often that you turn it over, you're going to deter the pests from setting up shop in your compost bin. And that's really important, because basically you're disturbing their home all the time, so they don't want to stay there. I will throw out a word of caution about turning your compost bin, especially if you're in the UK and you're in the southern parts of England, because slow worms, which are a protected species, they are often found in your compost heap because it's somewhere warm and moist. So if you are listening from the UK and you're in the southern counties, then do take care to be gentle as you're turning your compost heap, and be on the lookout for slow worms, so you don't disturb those too much. All right, let's talk next about layers not breaking down, and you'll see this in your compost heap as you start to move things and turn it over. You'll be like, oh, this whole layer here hasn't done anything. It still looks the exact same. And the likely cause is compaction and not enough air again. So you might start to see some themes here in how to correct some of the issues and what some of the causes are. So to fix this compaction issue, we want to be introducing air. We want to split up those compacted layers. So try mixing those green and brown materials before adding them to the compost bin. This is especially, easy to do with like the kitchen scraps that are going in, but this is really important to do if you're planning on adding your grass clippings to your compost bin. I don't add my grass clippings anymore to my compost bins. I actually I don't collect them. I just like let the mower kind of cut everything down, and it goes back onto the grass in the garden. But also, like, I have dogs running around my backyard, and I don't want doggy poop in my compost bin, so I no longer put grass clippings into the bin. But if you don't have the doggy landmine issue like I do, and you don't treat your lawn with weed killer or anything like that. Then make sure that you add the air into that grass before dumping it into the compost bin. So mix it in with like shredded paper, maybe some straw, anything that's like dry material that has been dead for a while. Shredded paper seems to be the best, and that's something that we seem to have access to quite a lot of on our homesteads, especially in the suburbs, right? Junk mail is a great source of carbon material for your compost bin. Just avoid putting anything that's like glossy, heavily printed and glossy in there. So, shred away those grocery store circulars or the newspaper. Those kind of things work really great. All right, let's talk about piles being very wet and sludgy. So your compost pile needs air, remember, to break things down, and too much water or too many green materials are a likely cause of it being wet and sludgy. And when you get a wet and sludgy compost pile, you're going to get that anaerobic respiration. It's going to be stinking. So you want to cover the pile to reduce excess rain getting in there, or you want to maybe change to an enclosed bin that you can then open up on sunny days to help dry out that heap. And then consider adding more brown materials, so more dry materials, things like straw. Straw's really good actually. Chipped twigs, junk mail, all that sort of stuff. Consider adding more of those things and mixing them in with that wet sludgy stuff to be able to take up some of the moisture. I will warn you now that as you're opening up a compost pile, if it is very wet and sludgy, maybe don't turn the compost pile if your neighbours are having a large fancy get together. That's a surefire way to upset people that are just over the fence. Just be wary of that. I mean, we tried to get out really early in the morning to turn the compost pile, partly because it's a lot cooler. I want to be doing these things like way before it gets hot here in Utah. And I know if you guys are in the southern states where you've got a lot of humidity, you've got a lot of moisture, a lot of water coming in, you maybe consider doing it sort of at the coolest times of day. And then it'll make it a lot easier for you to turn the pile, as well as hopefully disturbing fewer neighbours. All right, let's talk about lots of bugs in the compost, because your likely cause of that is a slow, cold decomposition. And the surefire way to fix that is to raise the temperature of the heap. And we do that by turning it over, mixing the outside materials that are drier to the inside materials, and watering the pile as you do so. Because what you're going to do there, you're adding in moisture, you're adding in air, and you are giving those microorganisms the oxygen that they need to then start to break things down again. You can also add some compost accelerators, and they tend to be things that are high in nitrogen, right? They've got a lot of available nitrogen. They're going to break down very quickly. Manure was one that's a very common compost activator to add in, especially chicken manure, but also comfrey. Like if you're looking for a manure-free alternative, like adding comfrey to your compost pile is an old gardener's trick to get your compost to start heat up and breaking down very quickly. The other thing to really help drive an increase in composting is adding a few sprigs of yarrow, and also considering bokashi to add to your compost. I love my bokashi bins. I've got multiple bokashi bins, but adding materials that have been fermented and treated with bokashi before adding them to the compost pile, like the compost goes so much faster doing that, because you're adding microorganisms, you're adding like a lot of nitrogen materials, and things just break down very, very rapidly, and that's going to like increase the temperature of the heap, and it's going to deter the bugs from there because it's going to be too hot for them, and that'll be kind of normal. So you'll see, like, maybe if you've got a colder pile, you have a lot of worms and things in there, and that's good that you've got lots of worms and stuff in there, but if you're wanting things to happen a lot more quickly, then you've got to do this hot kind of composting to do that. I know we talked about attracting vermin, but we didn't talk about attracting other animals, and by other animals I'm talking dogs. Dogs are very common to be found in a compost bin. Yes, that's right. I'm looking at you guys as I'm looking at my dogs. But not just dogs. Certainly here in the US, bears can be attracted to compost heaps, as well as other animals like raccoons and stuff. They're likely, again, to be attracted to things like cooked foods, the meat, dairy, and oils. You want to try and avoid putting those in unless you're going to pre-treat them with like bokashi and stuff beforehand. If you are able to get a predator-proof compost bin, then I would definitely recommend that. But you can also try to mix your kitchen scraps, your kitchen garbage, with soil from the from the garden, like garden soil, or even wood ashes before burying it in the middle of the pile. That might help to discourage the animals, and try the bokashi method as well, because bokashi, once it has fully fermented, it doesn't smell like what it did before. It's basically this lacto fermented stuff, and it's very acidic, so most animals are kind of deterred from going near it. So if you're really wanting to make full use of cooked foods and, meat or fish and dairy and stuff like that, that is, being used and, potentially being thrown out and being put into, the general waste, and you don't want to do that, definitely look to bokashi. You can also, use many of these methods together. So, you could add, your bokashi fermented materials to your compost bin. You can add in, some wood ashes. You can add in, soil from the garden as well. Like, all of these things are going to, help provide nutrients. They're going to help provide microorganisms. And if you're combining that with turning your pile regularly, you're adding a mixture of green material, brown material, and, watering and stuff when it's getting dry. You're, turning it regularly. All of these things are going to help your compost break down quickly. The quicker that your materials are breaking down into compost, number one, the quicker you can use that out in your garden, but also it's going to help deter some of these critters and things from being in your compost pile. I would love to see what your compost pile looks like. So please drop a picture out in the Facebook group. If you want to join, the link is in the description of this podcast, and show me how you're composting. I love to see how everybody is growing their garden, and there are some really amazing gardens that are going on, and some amazing techniques that people are sharing on, how to grow things vertically, or, building their gardens and just getting inspired. So come on over to the Facebook group, say hi. We don't bite. Gardeners are very, very generous, and we love to share and help each other grow. So until next week, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all then.